us tuning in for the Scholar Spotlight. My name is Brad Fulton, and I am the director of the Faith and Prejudice Institute, which is part of the larger Faith and Prejudice movement. The vision and mission of Faith and Prejudice is to convene, equip, and mobilize churches to build bridges to racial equity. And the Scholar Spotlight focuses on scholars who are working in this space at the intersection of race and religion and general social inequality. Today, we are interviewing Dr. Korver-Glenn. She earned her PhD in sociology from Rice University, and she's currently a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And she focuses on qualitative methods examining how cities and markets reproduce racial inequality. Today, we're going to focus on her book, Race Brokers, Housing Markets and Segregation in 21st Century Urban America. Thank you, Professor Korver-Glenn, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me and for inviting me onto the podcast.
Wonderful. Well, so as a sociologist, you're involved in some very fascinating research. And before we jump into your book and the stuff that you're working on, I'm kind of curious more to learn about your background and how you ended up becoming a professor who studies racial inequality.
Sure. So I grew up in a rural community that was characterized as a lot of sort of rural American communities are by a black-white divide, at least at that time, some decades ago. I think even as a child, I noticed these geographies, right, of where the white people live and where the black people live, even in a very small town. And then as I sort of grew into adulthood and began my graduate studies, I lived and worked in predominantly communities of color. And as I was starting my graduate studies, I became really interested in understanding how the things that I was experiencing as a white resident of a community of color in Houston were sort of mapping onto sort of broader issues of race and inequity, not only in Houston but in other parts of the country. And for me, it was really important to understand specifically the structure of racial segregation. In large part because I understand racial segregation as kind of one of the major linchpins of structural racial inequality in the United States. It's what allows for things like mass incarceration, for employment inequality, health inequality, educational inequality. All these various forms of inequality can be traced back to racial residential segregation. And so as I continued in my graduate career, I thought to myself, research and then also teaching and mentoring are ways that I can not only better understand racial segregation, but also equip others who can go on to do even more than me, right, and study this area, and also to produce research that actually can inform policies to minimize the harms of racial segregation and perhaps even promote racial equity across neighborhoods.
Well, that also triggers a lot more questions for me. The title of your book is Race Brokers, Housing Markets and Segregation in 21st Century Urban America. Can you share how you came up with the title for the book as a starter?
Sure. So the title of the book kind of came to me right as I was starting work on it. And this was in part because I was trying to sort of come up with a play on words. I think most folks understand, when you're trying to buy a house in the United States, typically most folks choose to work with a real estate broker or a real estate agent. And the vast majority of all people who are buying and selling homes in the United States actually do so. And so real estate brokers are key real estate professionals, and the real estate brokerage industry is a key industry that is part of sort of the broader housing market mechanics in our country. And so for me, it was a way to draw attention to both this group of people, not just real estate brokers, but real estate brokers prominent among them, and the ways in which both real estate brokerage industry and real estate brokers and ultimately other forms of other kinds of real estate industries and professionals end up using race and racism in their everyday work.
And so, and you talk about, I think you reference them as housing market professionals, like the broader category of race brokers in a sense. Maybe as a starting point, just so everyone's on the same page, what is a housing market?
Sure. So I guess in its simplest form, we can understand a housing market as the sort of, I guess in an abstract way, the space in which homes are exchanging hands. In some societies, homes exchange hands in ways that sort of uphold housing as a human right. It's not a commodity. In the United States, our housing market constructs and views housing as a commodity. And so that means in the United States housing market, we have a variety of institutions, laws, and policies that stretch back hundreds of years that have really cemented homes as particularly property ownership, ownership of homes as a means to buy and sell and ultimately profit from this particular commodity.
Hmm.
And going back specifically in our own country's history, the way in which home ownership and property ownership more broadly were established were specifically through the mechanisms of indigenous dispossession and racialized devaluation of communities of color. So, going back like 400 years, land and property, the notion of property doesn't even become it doesn't even take on meaning unless European colonizers and settlers are occupying it. Land that's sort of cultivated and that belongs to indigenous communities was viewed as worthless to European colonizers. And so through a variety of sort of legal mechanisms, dispossession, genocide, and other ways, European colonizers begin institutionalizing this idea that land is valuable if white people are present on it and are using it and extracting value from it. This carries forward into sort of the early 20th century United States, the sort of modernization of the American housing market, when what we might think of as sort of the modern real estate professions like real estate brokerage, the appraisal industry, mortgage banking, all go back to this idea that that property, and that includes residential homes, residential property, are valuable if white people are owning it and if white people are occupying it. And in fact, many of the inequities that we observe today go back to this very idea, in large part because the housing market as it functions today remains contingent on those ideas, even if they're not explicitly stated out loud.
So in a way, a housing market exists in the U.S. because housing or property has become a commodity. So in other contexts or other societies, if housing is not a commodity, then there wouldn't necessarily be a market for housing. Is that accurate?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, markets usually involve like the exchange of goods, right? And we could envision markets that are not predicated and indeed there are markets that are not predicated on sort of profit and the use of commodities to generate profit, right? So we can think of systems of bartering, for instance, that would maybe be considered a market, but are not necessarily predicated on profiting. And in our country, houses are commodities, and they are explicitly designed to be profited from. And in fact, for many Americans, actually, over the last 100 years, especially white Americans, home ownership has been a primary engine for wealth accumulation. And that was intentional. That was explicitly part of the federal government's attempts to sort of pull American society out of the Great Depression. And it doesn't have to be that way, but it has become that way. And that's the way I think a lot of folks understand homeownership these days.
Yeah, so for a lot of people, it's their single largest asset and investment, and so I can see obviously why it's a contentious issue. In your book, you talk about this category or broad category of housing market professionals and the role that they play to reinforce racial segregation in the markets. Can you share some of the housing market professionals and the things that they do that reinforce racial segregation?
Sure. So the primary housing market professionals and industries that I empirically examined for my research that I published in my book were housing developers, and the housing development industry, real estate agents and the real estate brokerage industry, mortgage bankers in the mortgage industry, and appraisers in the appraisal industry. So the each of these sort of sets of professionals are what we might call like market makers, right? Like they're the people that are actually doing the things like building the homes and deciding where to build them. They're the people who are connecting people to homes and home sellers. They're the people that are making decisions about who gets to have the mortgage capital and who gets access to the mortgage loan. And they're the people who are making determinations about a home's value. So each of these sets of professionals, housing developers, real estate agents, mortgage bankers, and appraisers, are working within industries that have particular sets of rules and norms, and they're working even within like federal and state policies that are pressuring them to act in certain ways. So for instance, we think of real estate agents across the United States. The norm for how real estate agents are paid is a percentage-based commission, right? So real estate agents earn a percentage of the home's contract price, essentially, when the home is sold. Often that commission is split between the home seller's real estate agent and the home buyer's real estate agent. So in Houston, where I did the research that's featured in my book, the going rate was 6%. That would be divided equally, usually between the listing agent and the buyer's agent, right? And so that's industry wide. It's you won't find it written down anywhere because real estate agents routinely told me that it was illegal to do so, but it is a norm. Which means it's something that's routinely practiced, and it's actually policed by real estate agents. So if other real estate agents try to give someone a break on their commission, other real estate agents will not work with them, or they'll report them to their boss or what have you, right? So it's a widely recognized way, and it's the means through which real estate agents get paid. However, that becomes a problem when we look at, for instance, going back to what the history and the present reality that I also discuss in my book of neighborhood racial inequality and home values, right? Mm-hmm. So as I discuss in the chapter on appraisal inequality in my book, with my colleague, Dr. Junia Howell, we have found that comparable homes, comparable size, amenities, lots, and so on, located in otherwise comparable communities. So talking about school quality, crime, socioeconomic status, home ownership, and all the things that real estate demand, all the things that get thrown out as reasons why there might be differences in value across neighborhoods. Even when we compare homes that are otherwise similar, neighborhoods that are otherwise similar, homes in white communities are routinely appraised at least twice as much as homes in communities of color. Real estate agents know this. And so as I described in my book, with these industry pressures and norms of getting paid through a percentage-based commission, they are intentionally trying to find clients who will get them paid the most. And they assume, and often they're right, that these clients will be white and those clients will live in white neighborhoods. Mm. They do their best work, they do the most work to try to get clients and customers that are in white neighborhoods and that are white, precisely because of how they are paid and what the norm for pay is in the industry, right?
Yeah.
So that's one example. Another example, and I'll just use the appraisal industry since I just referenced that. One of the things that I think is a surprise to a lot of people when I talk about this research is that the Fair Housing Act, which is wonderful, and it came with a lot of wonderful ways that fair housing lawyers and advocates can try to push back against housing discrimination. Something that the Fair Housing Act did not do was substantively change the way that homes are appraised. So the way that homes are appraised now, the way that appraisers are determining their opinions of home value, which is also required by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the sort of government enterprises that are federally backed and federally insured, is called the sales comparison approach. And this approach was intentionally formulated about 100 years ago precisely to increase home values in white neighborhoods and to devalue homes in communities of color. Nothing substantively changed about that method between like 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed and the next years. Nothing about that method changed. The thing that changes is that appraisers were no longer, the forms that they used no longer included a specific category about race. But the method itself has remained basically unchanged for all of that time. And so appraisers, even if they're, we might say like the good apples, right? Like as opposed to the sort of the bad racist apples, even if they are wonderful people and they have no malintent, just by using this method, they are injecting a racism and white supremacy into a home's value, into entire neighborhoods, because one home's value determines, and this method determines another home's value in that same area, right? And so, so even without the sort of racial animus or the overt racist prejudice, which I definitely observed and which you can see many examples of in my book, even if we somehow magically removed all of that, which we can't do, we would still have these industries and systems in place that are injecting racist ideas about people and places into the housing market. And professionals are the ones who are usually doing that work on the ground.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fascinating because in a sense, a system has been put in place that is perpetuating itself. Is kind of what you're describing, independent of racial bias. Racial bias is baked into it, but it doesn't have to be intentional because it's sort of already in process. But so I guess my question would be, how would you respond to a housing market professional who comes to you and says, Professor Korver-Glenn, very fascinating research, but really, I think you have it wrong. The things that are affecting the housing market decisions are purely economic factors, not race. People want to maximize their profit. They want to minimize their risk and uncertainty. And the property will sell at the value that the market determines that it's worth. And it has nothing to do with race. It's purely economics.
Yeah. Funny you should ask. I've had a number of housing market professionals give me some rendition of that over the years. Yeah, so I'll just respond in a couple of ways. One is that I've actually, in response to this, and actually talking to a variety of housing market professionals, I will sometimes give them social science evidence that indicates we have racial inequality even when we consider the economics of the situation. So, for instance, one of the things that came up repeatedly in the research is that people assumed that that Black and Latinx families have lower home ownership rates because their credit is bad on average. And so I would say, so again, to me, that's a racist assumption. To them, it's an economic explanation. So in response to that, I would say, well, hey, there's actually been a lot of social science research about that shows even when you're comparing people who have the exact same credit score, the exact same financial sort of qualification, same education, everything's the same except their race, we still see that racial inequity in access to mortgage loans, for instance. How would you explain that to me? Like, going to turn the question back.
Sure. Yeah.
And what happened more often than not is that those individuals who were usually white would try to find some other explanation that fit their pre-existing ideas about not the economics of the situation, but those racial groups, which to me was sort of revealing of what they were assuming the whole time, right? So one of the common ones was that, well, they probably just didn't have enough education about the process. Or something like that, right? So trying to continuing to sort of like manufacture any kind of sort of reason for what might be happening, anything other than acknowledging racism, which we might think of as like manufacturing racial ignorance. And there's a whole sociological literature about that, which is really fascinating and I think relevant there. Another thing that I would say, and this is something I've done more recently, especially when talking to people who are working in the appraisal industry, is they'll say like it's the market that creates the value, which is just patently untrue, because somebody is assigning value to homes, and we know that appraisers are the ones that are the professionals assigned by appraisal management companies who are sort of the third party companies that now that mortgage industry has to work with. And they go and they make their determinations of value. And if the value that the appraisers are assigning is less than the contract price, essentially the mortgage company can just say, this deal falls through. That's too much risk for us. So unless the home buyer is going to pony up more cash up front, or the home seller is willing to lower the price, we're not going to give out this mortgage loan, right? And so, so they do actually matter. Their determinations of value matter. And then the other side of that is that in the research that I've done with Dr. Junia Howell, we have actually accounted for things like real estate demand. We have actually measured real estate demand, and we have found that actually real estate demand is higher in places like Houston, in communities of color, and still home values in those areas are significantly lower than they are in white communities. We've also found that when we did a longitudinal study from 1980 to 2015, we looked at home values not just in Houston, but at more than 100 of the largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. And we found that actually neighborhood racial inequality and home values increased during that period, and that also accounted for real estate demand. That as real estate demand grew for instance, in predominantly like Black and Latinx cities, home values actually declined. And so for us, it's about going back to the data and sort of calling out to folks like, listen, we hear you. We understand that, these are the sort of the usual sort of worn out explanations for why these racial inequities persist. But when you actually look at the data and see like actually real estate demand is very high in communities of color, you start to see there's a mismatch between the common explanations, sort of the colloquial explanations for low values, and what's actually happening on the ground. And those disjunctures, I argue in my book, are actually just because of racism, the ways that the housing market continues to inject racism in the market.
Yeah, well, and also what I appreciate about your book is actually the structure of your book, how it lays out the chapters, is all the different players in the housing market, and then you provide a lot of evidence for each of those players in the role that they play in perpetuating racial inequality. And I think that personally, I just like the way that it's laid out. One category, and I'm thinking about this in the context of Faith and Prejudice, is you talk about housing market professionals perpetuating racial inequality and racial segregation. And I think about it in the context of congregations. So congregations are ubiquitous. They're in communities throughout the U.S., and they choose where they're going to locate, where they're going to build a congregation, or where they're going to buy property. I'm curious if you've had any thoughts on the roles that congregations might play in perpetuating racial segregation.
Sure. So I'll just start by saying that I'll bracket my comments specifically for white congregations. That's where some of the research I've done in the past has been. It's kind of coming from my own faith context, more familiarity with that. But there's actually been some research on this that I think is really interesting and telling. Dr. Mark Mulder wrote a book not too long ago called Shades of White Flight that talks about some of the sort of the historical and very explicitly racist efforts of white congregations to sort of shore up racial segregation. They essentially trying to prevent white congregants from leaving the neighborhood. Tried essentially, when that failed, policing Black communities essentially that moved in to what were previously white neighborhoods, and eventually, like doors end up closing. Right. It's been a while since I've read the book, but that's what I remember. And how essentially like white congregations have played an active role in attempting to maintain racial segregation, which has roots not only in sort of like faith tradition and like biblical interpretation and all that, but also in the money. It's actually related to going back to what I was talking about before, like property values. And the ways that even churches, right, have long been, white churches have long been invested in like how much is this property worth, right? I think the money question is a really important part of that, right? And I think that is a question that continues today, right? So how do for instance, we might call them like legacy congregations, like white congregations, whether they're evangelical, mainline, or whatever, who built properties. Where did the money to build those properties come from? Did it come from money that was donated through inheritances? Where did the inheritance come from, right? Like where does the money come
Hmm.
from? We know that white families have disproportionately profited from this system over the last 100
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
Um, like I mean, it's
Hmm.
astounding. I mean, even just the last 10 years alone, white families' wealth through home ownership has increased exponentially faster
Hmm.
than home ownership among communities of color, right? So where do congregations, where are they located? Not only
Hmm.
like where do they choose to locate, but how do they pay for their properties? Where do the families who live in those or where do the families who are congregants in those
Hmm.
congregations live,
Hmm.
and make choices about where to live? Where does their wealth come from that they're
Hmm.
tithing to the church? So I think there are a lot of sort of thorny questions that I have yet to see white congregations wrestle with,
Sure.
by and large, but I think are absolutely important to these sort of like broader issues. And I think that actually white congregations and white congregational leaders could do a lot to try to actually, I guess, ignite or inspire sort of structural thinking about
Hmm.
how not only like individual families are part of this, but
Hmm.
how sort of the church as an organization,
Hmm.
or congregations as organizations, are involved in sort of reproducing the structure of racial segregation.
Yeah, no, I mean, that resonates well because I often think um, white people tend to be beneficiaries of racialized systems, and in the same light, white congregations have been beneficiaries of this racialized system. And I can think of some individual level micro responses that people or even congregations could make. But I'm curious, like you talked about the structural aspects, and if you really want to see widespread and enduring change, you need some structural changes. And I'm curious if you have ideas of how congregations and their members could collectively address some of these things that you raise in your book as problematic. Like, what are ways that congregations could actually, they embrace this, they say, yes, this is an issue, this is something that we want to be a part of the change. What suggestions would you have or ideas?
Yeah, so I mean I'm not gonna promise that people would like these suggestions, but but I mean I think seriously about the implications of kind of going back to the adage of like Sunday morning being the most segregated hour of the week, right?
Mm-hmm,
Like
mm-hmm,
that congregations are even more segregated than our neighborhoods,
mm-hmm,
and the fact that white congregations, the people who are members of those congregations, are disproportionately living in overwhelmingly white communities. We know that's true.
mm-hmm,
That means they are actively benefiting from the system of hypervaluation of homes in white communities, for
mm-hmm,
instance. That disproportionately their sort of like equity that they're getting out of their home, wealth, educational security, intergenerational wealth transfers, how much money they can give to the church, like all of that is happening.
mm-hmm,
And so I think one of the things for me is really for congregations to take the money seriously,
mm-hmm,
follow the money. Where does the money come from? Where does the money go? um is sort of individual family uh, financial security and wealth accumulation sort of take like assumed to be okay, and like
mm-hmm,
this is the good, this is the American dream, so it's okay? Or are we looking critically, or congregations looking critically at, like, well, what does it mean that people of faith in our congregation are actually actively benefiting from this unequal system, and that's actually propping up this congregation in some way through tithes and whatever.
sure.
um so really like taking the money seriously. So I know, for example, of one congregation where, in finding out about some of my research, started looking into where some of their investments were.
Mm-hmm,
And they made the choice that, like, oh, they realized some of the investments were going into Fannie Mae, basically Fannie Mae's like secondary mortgage market,
Mm-hmm.
and they were like, "Oh wow, so just through our own like our investments, like we're
Mm-hmm.
benefiting from this system that Fannie Mae is underwriting, like quite literally underwriting, right?" So they made the choice to like not be investing with that anymore, right? So following the money, where does the money go? How is it related? We know it's related to housing, and like I
Mm-hmm.
will continue to
Mm-hmm.
argue until the day I die. Everything goes back to housing. Um, Another thing is, a lot of people, I'm familiar with congregations who have, I think, especially in the recent years, expressed concerns about affordable housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so many people, so I know of many people who are trying to advocate for affordable housing. I know of many
Mm-hmm.
individuals who volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's fine and good. And I would also say, well, another thing to do is not only realize that the affordable housing issue is intimately related to the hypervaluation of homes in white communities. Um, this is because over the last like 40 years or so, there's been basically a tenfold increase in the valuation of homes, and the vast majority of that has been concentrated in white communities. Meanwhile, people's wages haven't kept up, and so now we have an affordability crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So meanwhile, so they're intimately related. We have unaffordable housing because families in white communities are getting more and more wealth, and their price,
Mm-hmm.
the values of their homes are going up and up and up and up, right? And so these things are very much related. So unless we dismantle the system of valuing homes and communities that are white much more than we value homes and communities that are neighborhoods of color, the affordable housing issue isn't going to go away. It's just going to keep happening, right? So I know of a couple of policymakers who are actively working on these issues. So I always try to point people to them.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, Congressman Al Green is one, Congresswoman Maxine Waters is another. And so there are ways that individuals and congregations can definitely be concerned about affordable housing, and then also continue to work to try to address some of the structural issues, and work with uh, not only local policy but national policymakers to advocate for some of these changes.
Sure.
And then another idea I had is to actually have congregations get involved with nonprofits who are actually advocating for and implementing structural solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So one of these nonprofit organizations is Iruka, which was co-founded or founded, and is co-directed by my colleague Dr. Howell. It's ERUKA, and they are actually beginning to implement solutions that are not essentially reproducing the status quo of how housing is normally exchanged, how the housing market normally works in our country, but are actually implementing equitable insurance, valuation, and other financial and housing services that I think I think a lot of congregations could get behind as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, this is very fascinating. I feel like we're only scratching the surface of what your book entails. And I agree with you that housing and I guess largely housing markets are a key indicator or predictor of a lot of other social outcomes. And I feel like what's wonderful about your book is it gives a nice crash course on the housing market industry. Like people, if you even buy one house, you probably only do it once every 10 years or something like that. So you're just not exposed to the whole system and understanding it. And so it's great how you kind of lay everything out. But then also you make a very incisive argument in regards to the bias, the racial bias baked in to each component of the system. So I really appreciate you dedicated a tremendous amount of work and effort to making this book possible. And now it's available to all of us. So I appreciate you even taking time today to talk. I also appreciate everyone else who's here listening. Thank you for engaging in this topic. If you want to learn more about Professor Korver-Glenn's book, I encourage you to buy it and check it out. And also go to her website. She has a lot of other resources that are available, and we'll post that in the comments as well. But thank you, everyone, very much, and for participating in the Scholar Spotlight.